Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Tonight, we turn our attention to a name rarely spoken aloud and never fully understood: Azathoth, the so-called blind idiot god at the center of the Lovecraftian universe. In popular adaptations, Azathoth is often framed as an explosive apocalypse waiting to awaken. But that idea, while cinematic, may obscure something far more unsettling. If Azathoth ever did wake up, it's not what you think. The terror isn't in the destruction it might cause. It's in what its awakening implies about everything else. Across this investigation, we will trace Azathoth's elusive origins, from Lovecraft's fragmented notes and poetic fragments to ancient cosmologies that whisper of similar sleeping forces. We'll examine what Azathoth truly represents, a challenge not just to theology, but to meaning itself. Then we'll confront its literary shadows, explore its symbolic function, and follow its haunting afterlife in subcultures, hoaxes, games, and academia. This isn't just about a monster, it's about the limits of knowing, the fear of irrelevance, and the cosmic indifference that sits at the edge of human thought. Our journey is slow, layered, and deeply uncomfortable. But if you're still listening, you've already begun to drift closer to that silent center, where something vast dreams without language, without mind, and possibly without us. Let's begin. To understand Azathoth, we must first situate its emergence within the intellectual turbulence of the early 20th century. Lovecraft wrote most actively between 1919 and 1927, a period shaped by the aftermath of the First World War, accelerating industrial modernity, and the unsettling expansion of astronomical knowledge. Edwin Hubble's later confirmation of galaxies beyond the Milky Way in 1924 did not occur in isolation. It formalized a decentering already underway in scientific discourse. Humanity was no longer merely displaced from the cosmic center. It appeared statistically negligible. Lovecraft absorbed this shift with unusual intensity. Consider this carefully. Cosmic horror did not arise from superstition, but from scientific revelation. Azathoth, therefore, belongs to a literary response to modernity, joining a broader intellectual movement that grappled with entropy, mechanization, and the erosion of theological certainty. Lovecraft's private correspondence offers unusually direct insight into his creator intent. In letters from 1919 and 1920, he described envisioning a universe governed by blind forces, devoid of moral architecture. This reveals something profound. Azathoth was conceived less as a character than as a metaphysical condition. Where earlier horror relied on curses, ghosts, or transgressions, Lovecraft proposed an indifferent cosmos operating without narrative purpose. Compare this with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, 1818, where creation still implies responsibility, or Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1897, where evil retains recognizable agency. Azathoth embodies something colder, an existence without intention, not a tyrant, but an absence of governance. The distinction matters because horror shifts from confrontation to comprehension. The threat lies in understanding the structure of reality rather than surviving an encounter within it. We must pause here to examine influence. Scholars frequently note Lovecraft's admiration for Lord Dunsany, particularly the deity Manayud Sushai, who sleeps while lesser beings maintain cosmic rhythm through drumming. Yet the resemblance should not be overstated. Dunsany's universe retains mythic coherence. Sleep implies eventual awakening within a narrative cycle. Lovecraft strips away that reassurance. Azathoth does not sleep in expectation of renewal. It drifts at the nuclear center, surrounded by mindless musicians whose function appears automatic. This is not mythic order, but metaphysical inertia. The comparison illuminates a critical transition from romantic fantasy to mechanistic horror, from enchanted cosmology to existential vacancy. In triadic terms, myth promised structure, religion promised meaning, science promised explanation. Azathoth quietly undermines all three. Etymological speculation reinforces this interpretive frame. Lovecraft reportedly assembled names for phonetic effect rather than semantic lineage, yet Azathoth produces an auditory impression of antiquity through harsh consonants and terminal breath. The name feels inherited rather than invented. According to some commentators, its cadence faintly echoes Thoth, the Egyptian deity of knowledge, a possible irony given Azathoth's association with mindlessness. Not knowledge, but its negation. Not intelligence, but its collapse. Such constructions demonstrate Lovecraft's sensitivity to linguistic psychology. Readers respond to texture before analysis begins. Consider how the term nuclear chaos operates rhetorically. It invokes emerging atomic theory while remaining scientifically imprecise. Lovecraft weaponized ambiguity, allowing readers to project contemporary anxieties onto an undefined center. Azathoth's earliest textual traces reinforce the strategy of indirect presence. The unfinished prose fragment, Azathoth, circa 1922, introduces a dreamer drawn toward an unnamed cosmic throne, yet description dissolves before revelation occurs. Later, in the dream quest of unknown Kadath, written 1926 to 1927, Azathoth appears only as a distant locus beyond the reach of sane travelers. This evidentiary pattern deserves emphasis. Lovecraft builds authority through omission. The entity gains credibility precisely because it resists depiction. Compare this method to Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, 1907, where the unseen generates dread more effectively than any visible antagonist. Absence becomes a narrative technology. Readers sense gravitational pull without observational data, much as astrophysicists infer dark matter through its effects rather than its form. What then did Lovecraft intend audiences to confront? His essays repeatedly argue that the universe is fundamentally indifferent to human aspiration. Azathoth crystallizes this proposition into mythic shorthand. The flutes that surround the entity, described as thin, monotonous, ceaseless, suggest a cosmos operating through automatic processes rather than conscious design. One might even interpret them as metaphors for physical laws: persistent, unhearing, indifferent. Consider the philosophical inversion at work here. Traditional cosmologies positioned humanity beneath watchful divinity. Lovecraft positions humanity within unattended machinery. The emotional result differs profoundly. Fear once derived from judgment. Now it derives from neglect. A rhetorical question naturally emerges. Why invent a god that cannot think? The answer lies in narrative economy. By removing intention, Lovecraft removes negotiation. There is no pact to bargain, no curse to lift, no rebellion to mount. This reveals something profound about early 20th century pessimism. Catastrophe no longer required malice. It could arise from structure alone. The idea parallels contemporary discussions of thermodynamic heat death, increasingly popular in scientific writing around 1900 to 1930. Entropy needs no villain. Lovecraft translated that abstraction into symbolic form. Yet creator intent should not be confused with systematic theology. Lovecraft resisted rigid mythologies, preferring what scholars call open architecture. Azathoth functions as a conceptual boundary rather than a doctrinal center. Writers within his circle, Clark Ashton Smith, later August Derleth, attempted greater classification, but Lovecraft himself favored suggestive incompleteness. Supposedly, this preserved imaginative participation. Readers become co-constructors of dread. We might say the myth expands through interpretive silence. As we transition forward, a pattern becomes visible. Azathoth did not emerge in isolation, but at the intersection of scientific decentering, philosophical pessimism, and evolving narrative technique. The entity reflects a culture learning, perhaps reluctantly, to imagine a universe without supervision. Having established the historical ground from which Azathoth arose, we must now look deeper, beyond Lovecraft's desk, and into the older intellectual currents that made such a figure conceivable. In the next subsection, we turn to those antecedents, the chaos myths, metaphysical traditions, and philosophical tensions that prepared readers, long before Lovecraft, to contemplate a cosmos whose center might be awake, asleep, or indifferent beyond comprehension. Azathoth may have been named in the early 20th century, but its conceptual roots stretch far deeper into the human archive. Every civilization, at some stage, has imagined a primordial chaos, formless, sleeping, unknowable. What Lovecraft did was not invent a new fear, but refine a very old one for a modern context. He tapped into a lineage of myths and metaphysical anxieties that once gave shape to the incomprehensible. Understanding Azathoth means recognizing the traditions it echoes, inverting or amplifying them to chilling effect. The most obvious antecedent is mythic chaos, a timeless force from which order briefly rises. In Mesopotamian mythology, Tiamat embodies this principle, a dragon of saltwater chaos slain by Marduk to form the heavens and earth. Similarly, in Greek cosmogony, chaos is the void that precedes Gaia, Tartarus, and Eros. These early concepts share two traits. They precede structure, and they must be subdued or shaped to allow existence as we know it. In contrast, Azathoth is not conquered nor ordered. It persists beneath all things. If traditional chaos was a problem to be solved, Lovecraft's chaos is a presence that never left. But this cosmic indifference also resonates with Gnostic theology, particularly the idea of the demiurge, a blind, defective creator who believes himself to be the supreme God. In texts like the Apocryphon of John, this demiurge creates the material world in ignorance, his blindness reflecting both his separation from the divine and the brokenness of reality. Azathoth, too, is blind. Yet the Gnostic model retains hope. Salvation comes through hidden knowledge, gnosis. Lovecraft offers no such escape. Knowledge does not liberate, it annihilates. This is one of his sharpest inversions. In Buddhist metaphysics, the concept of shunyata, or emptiness, is essential. All phenomena are void of intrinsic self. When compassion and insight frame this doctrine, it leads to transcendence. But strip away the ethics and discipline, and what remains is a terrifying neutrality. No self, no center, no permanent ground. Azathoth echoes this condition, yet distorts it. Instead of the meditative stillness of nirvana, we are left with idiot motion and noise. The world is not empty like a sky. It's empty like a headless machine. Lovecraft also seemed to echo Nietzsche's abyss, a recurring metaphor for the void encountered when traditional values collapse. Nietzsche's famous line, "If you gaze long into the abyss, the abyss also gazes into you, signals a philosophical danger. We may become what we behold. Lovecraft intensifies this risk. Those who attempt to understand Azathoth do not merely encounter the void, they dissolve into it. This differs from existentialism's emphasis on confronting absurdity with personal responsibility. Lovecraft's horror offers no agency, no revolt. The human subject is not heroic, but disposable. Another key philosophical influence emerges from the post-Copernican crisis. The heliocentric model didn't just remove Earth from the center, it removed humankind from any privileged place in the cosmos. By the 19th century, this displacement was complete. Astronomy, geology, and biology had each dismantled a pillar of exceptionalism. Lovecraft absorbed this cosmic marginalization with unusual consistency. Azathoth sits where God once sat, but offers no light, no love, no judgment, only dissonance. This is not merely atheism, it is anti-theism, the suggestion that replacing God with chaos may not be neutral, but horrifying. The music surrounding Azathoth, thin, monotonous flutes, finds a parallel in the Pythagorean concept of the music of the spheres, where celestial bodies were thought to move in harmonious mathematical order. Lovecraft's version is a parody. No harmony, only ceaseless sound without progression. Consider this carefully. Even the metaphor of music, once used to suggest cosmic order, becomes a vessel of dread when emptied of pattern. The structure remains, but meaning does not. Yet perhaps the most haunting antecedent comes not from myth or philosophy, but from epistemology, the fear that to know is to destroy. In this sense, Azathoth is the limit condition of Enlightenment rationality. The very drive that fueled scientific progress, curiosity, systematization, naming, collapses at its outer edge. The cosmos is not a puzzle to solve, but a mechanism whose workings erase the observer. In Kantian terms, the noumenal realm lies beyond perception, but for Lovecraft, approaching it doesn't yield transcendental truth. It yields obliteration. Azathoth, then, is not merely a fictional god. It is a repository for displaced metaphysical dread. It fuses pre-modern chaos myths, Gnostic blind creation, Buddhist emptiness, Nietzschean abyssal thought, and post-Enlightenment despair into one symbol. Not a symbol that teaches, but one that refuses closure. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft did not need to depict Azathoth in narrative, because we already live with its implications. Every cosmology with a silent center, every philosophy that questions selfhood, every scientific model that renders us accidental participants in a blind unfolding, each is a whisper of Azathoth. And still, it dreams. In our next section, we will turn toward language itself. If Azathoth resists meaning, how does Lovecraft name it? How do syllables, flutes, and silence create a god that cannot speak, yet can never be unheard? The etymology and symbolic language surrounding Azathoth offer another mirror. Distorted, broken, but revealing nonetheless. Azathoth's power lies not in what it does, but in what it disrupts, including language itself. In Lovecraft's world, names are never incidental. They are incantations, traces of impossible reference. Yet unlike names in ancient myth, which clarify and categorize, Azathoth's name resists understanding. It sounds like something we should recognize, and that's precisely the danger. We reach for meaning, only to find misdirection. Azathoth cannot be translated, only uttered, and in that utterance, something begins to unravel. Lovecraft himself acknowledged that many of his invented names were not derived from formal etymology, but built for phonetic effect. In a letter to Clark Ashton Smith, 1933, He described choosing barbarous-sounding syllables to invoke ancient, non-human resonance. Azathoth stands among the most successful of these constructs. Phonetically, it fuses harsh consonants with breathy fricatives, aza, a gasp, thoth, a terminal sigh. The result is unstable, teetering between invocation and expiration. The name sounds like an idea collapsing under its own weight. Scholars have long speculated about the name's illusions. The final syllable, thoth, evokes the Egyptian god Thoth, deity of writing, logic, and cosmic order. This resemblance is almost certainly intentional. Whether ironic or blasphemous, the pairing of Azathoth's chaos with Thoth's order suggests a deliberate inversion. What if the god of language had a mirror, and that mirror stuttered? Consider this. Azathoth may not just oppose meaning, it may echo it falsely, distorting every attempt to comprehend. Not the god of anti-meaning, but the malfunctioning god of meaning itself. The prefix Aza is more elusive. Some have linked it to Semitic roots like Azazel, a scapegoat demon in Jewish tradition, or Azaz, meaning strong or fierce. But these comparisons, while linguistically convenient, are unconvincing in Lovecraft's context. He preferred to build emotional resonance through phonetic association, not scholarly derivation. The key was sound. Aza opens the mouth, an almost infantile syllable. It feels like the beginning of speech. Yet paired with Thoth, it concludes in erasure. The name begins with breath, ends with oblivion. Its symbolic structure contains its message, from utterance to unbeing. Language around Azathoth is similarly broken. In nearly every mention across Lovecraft's works, it is couched in distancing terms: nameless, formless, blasphemous, idiotic. The repetition of negating descriptors builds a wall of abstraction. The more one attempts to describe Azathoth, the more language folds in on itself. Compare this to biblical or mythic texts, where divine names grant access or control. Invoking Ra, Jehovah, or Odin brings power. Azathoth's name offers no mastery. Instead, it functions like a linguistic sinkhole, dragging all attempts at signification into disarray. Then there is the music. The flutes surrounding Azathoth are not incidental set dressing. They are the soundtrack of unmeaning. Lovecraft describes them as thin, monotonous piping that is ceaseless and silly. Note the tonal contrast. Silliness, in Lovecraft's usage, does not connote humor, but absurdity stripped of coherence. This is noise without progression. The flutes do not build, resolve, or vary. They loop. In classical cosmology, music often symbolizes divine harmony. In Pythagorean thought, the movement of celestial spheres produces inaudible music, ordered, mathematical, sublime. Azathoth's music parodies this tradition. What if the music of the spheres were played by no one, for no reason? Symbolically, the flute serves as both metaphor and method. It is breath weaponized into disorder. There are no lyrics, no invocation, only vibration without purpose. If the Christian Logos asserts that "in the beginning was the Word," then Azathoth answers with sound without words, rhythm without language. It is not silent, but unintelligibly loud. The distinction is key. Silence implies absence. Azathoth implies presence without content. The surrounding servitors, those who play the flutes, are likewise unnamed and formless. They exist only to perpetuate the sound. This too is symbolic language. These entities do not speak, worship, or even witness Azathoth. They play, and they do so without will. Consider the symbolic economy. Azathoth, the unmind at the center, surrounded by mindless agents producing purposeless sound. The image reverses every theological trope of divine choirs or angelic order. Here, creation sings not in joy, but in compulsion. In literary terms, Azathoth's very structure functions as a semantic black hole. It draws meaning toward itself only to dismantle it. This is why Lovecraft never wrote a full narrative about Azathoth. To describe it directly would be to violate its function. The few words we are given, nuclear chaos, demon sultan, blind idiot god, are not attributes but warnings. They alert us not to characteristics, but to the danger of trying to assign them. The language is not evocative, it is evasive. And yet, Azathoth lingers in language. Its name appears in rituals, in dreams, in cursed books whispered about in footnotes. It becomes a signifier of unsignifiability, a paradox that sustains its potency. This is the genius of Lovecraft's symbolic system. He created a god that operates like a failure of language, and then let that failure proliferate. As we move forward, this linguistic disruption becomes more than a stylistic device. It becomes a philosophical mechanism. In the next section, we will examine how Lovecraft used myth building, not to encode answers, but to fracture them. Azathoth is not a character in a story, but a rupture in the story's logic. And through this rupture, Lovecraft built a mythology that still resists comprehension to this day. Azathoth occupies a strange position in the Lovecraftian mythos, everywhere invoked, almost never described. This absence is not an oversight. It is the central mechanic of its mythic function. Unlike traditional deities, Azathoth gains power not from actions or appearances, but from narrative evasion. The more we read around it, the more we feel its gravity. Myth, in this context, is not a tool for understanding, but a system for concealing the void beneath. Lovecraft's myth-building did not rely on coherent theology or linear storytelling. Instead, he constructed what literary theorist M. Keith Booker has called negative myth-making, a process by which meaning is constructed through omission, fragmentation, and contradiction. Azathoth is the apex of this strategy. Its mythology is distributed across footnotes, diary entries, secondhand reports, and forgotten fragments. There is no authoritative tale of Azathoth. That absence makes it feel more real. The authenticity emerges from the illusion of archival depth. Lovecraft understood that belief is rarely built on consistency. Real myths are messy, evolving across generations, cultures, and agendas. He mimicked this process deliberately. The Necronomicon, for example, is never quoted at length. We encounter it in scraps, warnings, rumors. Likewise, Azathoth exists primarily in citations. In the dream quest of unknown Cthulhu, it is described not by name at first, but as the monstrous nuclear chaos beyond angled space. This reveals something profound. Lovecraft wanted readers to feel like they were overhearing myth, not receiving it, as though the story had already begun and we are merely catching up. Narrative authenticity, in this framework, is built from indirection. Azathoth is never given a full scene, not because Lovecraft lacked ideas, but because full exposition would diminish the effect. The less we see, the more we imagine. And unlike traditional myths, where gods reveal themselves to mortals, Azathoth offers no revelation. Its myth is not transmitted through epiphany, but through epistemic corrosion. The reader never learns more, only loses certainty. This mythic ambiguity is reinforced through unreliable narrators. From the whisperer in darkness to the haunter of the dark, Lovecraft populates his stories with seekers, individuals who desire understanding but collapse upon approaching it. Azathoth becomes the end point of this pattern. It is not encountered, but inferred. The more one seeks it, the less one remains capable of narration. We never hear a first-hand account of Azathoth, because no narrator survives that moment of clarity. In this way, Azathoth is a myth of narrative collapse. Its presence dissolves the story it inhabits. Consider the structure of the Dunwich Horror, or the Call of Cthulhu. Though not about Azathoth directly, these stories model a form of myth-building that Lovecraft mastered: triangulation. Each narrator receives fragments from others: letters, transcripts, dreams. No single perspective suffices. Myth is pieced together like forensic evidence. This technique simulates real-world myth transmission, where oral traditions and contradictory accounts coexist. Azathoth thrives in this system. Its myth never stabilizes, which makes it feel enduring. We must also acknowledge the role of textual contamination. The Necronomicon, the Pinacotic manuscripts, the Book of Ibon, all contain references to Azathoth, but in inconsistent contexts. Is it the creator of the universe? A force slumbering at the center of the cosmos? A demon sultan attended by mindless flautists? The answer shifts depending on the source. This multiplicity does not weaken the myth, it strengthens it. Real religious texts do the same. Inconsistency creates space for interpretation, and interpretation breeds belief. Lovecraft's mythos mimics this organically, and yet Azathoth's myth resists closure. It cannot be resolved into a single symbolic role. Unlike Cthulhu, who functions clearly as a god of dreams and awakening, Azathoth is slippery. It is described as mindless, idiotic, blind, nuclear, chaos, center, demon sultan. These descriptors offer hints, but no cohesion. The myth's power lies in its refusal to settle. Each term opens a different conceptual door. Nuclear suggests physics. Demon sultan implies courtly madness. Chaos evokes pre-creation states. The terms compete rather than align. This semantic volatility enhances Azathoth's narrative authenticity. In traditional mythology, gods often possess shifting attributes across time. Zeus as thunderer, seducer, lawgiver. Lovecraft compresses that multivalence into a figure that never speaks for itself. Its identity is built entirely by others, and thus always contingent. Readers engage with Azathoth not as a subject, but as an object of speculation. In this way, the myth behaves like a black hole. We know it only by the distortions it causes in the narratives around it. Finally, we must note how this myth spreads. Lovecraft invited collaboration. Writers like August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, and later Ramsey Campbell extended the mythos, sometimes contradicting its core logic. Derleth, for instance, attempted to impose a moral dualism onto the mythos, casting Azathoth as the elemental representative of chaos, opposed by order. Lovecraft himself resisted such taxonomy. For him, the mythos was not a theology, but a negative cosmology. Azathoth's myth sustains itself because it denies coherence. Each edition risks weakening its essence, and so the myth endures, not through revelation, but through its refusal. Azathoth is the god you cannot meet, the story you cannot tell, the meaning you cannot hold. Its narrative is not built from what it does, but from what it undermines: voice, agency, structure, and certainty. As we move into part 2, the framework expands. Having examined how Azathoth's myth is transmitted, we now explore what it means. In the next section, we confront the philosophical void Azathoth represents, not as character, but as concept, a challenge to human thought itself. Azathoth is not a god in the traditional sense. It does not embody justice, vengeance, fertility, or even death. It has no mythic morality, no cultic favor, no epic deeds. Instead, Azathoth is a symbol, crafted precisely to stand where human concepts fail. Its horror is not what it does, but what it implies. That meaning, structure, and agency are illusions projected onto a universe that never asked for them. To engage Azathoth philosophically is to dismantle the scaffolding of human thought itself. It is not an antagonist. It is the absence of narrative. The first and most persistent concept Azathoth represents is cosmic insignificance. This is not the romantic nihilism of Gothic literature, where isolation is personal and tragic. Lovecraft's insignificance is structural and absolute. Humanity is not small, it is irrelevant. The universe does not notice us. It does not even possess the capacity for noticing. Azathoth sits at the center of this vision, the nucleus of unreason. Its position is symbolic. It occupies the throne that monotheistic gods once claimed, yet offers no guidance, no observation, no reaction. There is no observer effect in this cosmology. The experiment proceeds with or without us. This philosophical dissentering reflects early 20th century anxieties. The Copernican revolution had long since displaced Earth from the center of the cosmos. Darwin's evolution removed us from divine creation. Freud's psychoanalysis shattered the unity of the self. Einstein's relativity disrupted time. By the 1920s, the Western mind had been systematically deconstructed. Azathoth arrives as the symbol of what remains, a universe without human orientation, not cold but indifferent, not evil but unconscious. If there is horror, it is existential. We are not merely alone, we were never involved. Consider this carefully. Azathoth is not the void. It is activity without mind. This brings us to the second concept, entropy. In thermodynamics, entropy measures disorder, the dissipation of energy, the inevitable decline of systems into equilibrium. Lovecraft read widely in science, and the idea of heat death, the eventual fate of a universe running out of usable energy, was circulating heavily in early 20th century thought. Azathoth does not merely sleep. It drifts at the heart of everything, surrounded by ceaseless, purposeless motion. The monotonous piping of the servitors becomes a metaphor for the universe's background processes, unending, patternless, and terminal. Unlike traditional myth, which links chaos to beginnings, as in Tiamat or chaos in Hesiod, Azathoth represents perpetual chaos. It is not the prelude to cosmos, but its true condition. The structured world is temporary, artificial, and perhaps hallucinatory. The deeper reality is mechanical madness. This inversion unsettles foundational mythic logic. Where entropy in scientific discourse is measurable, predictable, and gradual, Lovecraft mythologizes it. Azathoth is entropy deified, an eternal collapse mistaken for creation. And here we meet the third, and perhaps most disquieting, concept, dream reality. Multiple stories in the Lovecraft corpus hint that our world may be a dream in the mind of something else, but Azathoth inverts even this idea. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, the protagonist is warned that beyond the gates of deeper slumber lies Azathoth, whose name no lips dare speak aloud, and who gnaws hungrily in the center of all infinity. This is not the benevolent dream of Brahman in Hindu philosophy, nor the generative dreaming of Australian Aboriginal cosmology. Azathoth's dream is not meaningful. It is not even coherent. This introduces an unbearable possibility. that reality itself is a side effect of a mindless dreamer, that cause and effect, morality, logic, these are all contingent hallucinations within a dream that could shift, collapse, or forget us without knowing it. If Cthulhu represents the fear of awakening, Azathoth represents the fear that we were never awake to begin with. The image is not of a god about to awaken, but of us beginning to suspect that what we call waking life is a byproduct of unconscious dreaming. This blends directly into philosophical questions about subjectivity and ontology. If reality is dream-generated, whose epistemology holds? In Descartes' Meditations, the possibility of dreaming undermines knowledge, but leads to a reaffirmation of the self. Cogito, ergo sum. Lovecraft strips even that away. If the dreamer is mindless, there is no subject to reassure, only process, no I dreaming, just it. Azathoth nullifies the Cartesian project in a single stroke. Not, I think, therefore I am, but it dreams, and we are erased. In this structure, Azathoth becomes not just a cosmic placeholder, but a philosophical terminus. It marks the edge of knowability, not because it is hidden, but because it is empty. All attempts to define it fail, not due to lack of data, but due to an epistemological mismatch. Our instruments, our minds, our symbols, they were built for narrative universes. Azathoth offers noise instead of signal, void instead of truth. The horror is not in discovering something new, but in realizing the tools of discovery no longer apply. And yet, the myth persists. We name it. We imagine it. We write around it. This reveals something even more disturbing. The human mind prefers madness over silence. We would rather envision a blind idiot god than accept the absence of gods altogether. Azathoth, then, is not just a figure of horror, but of complicity. We sustain it. We animate it. The blind god dreams, and perhaps we are the ones playing the flutes. Next, we follow the ripple of this philosophical impact into the architecture of the mythos itself. If Azathoth is a concept more than a creature, then what other entities, what servitors, intermediaries, or shadows take shape in its gravitational pull? We now turn to the beings and structures orbiting this central void. Azathoth, by design, lacks individuality. It cannot act, decide, or even perceive. And yet, the mythos surrounding it teems with activity. Beings orbiting its presence, extending its influence, or embodying the different facets of its unknowing. These are not agents in the traditional sense, but manifestations of metaphysical gravity. Just as a black hole draws matter without intent, Azathoth draws symbolic entities into its orbit, each reflecting some facet of chaos, mindlessness, or intermediary distortion. At the center sits Azathoth itself, the demon sultan, the blind idiot god, the nuclear chaos. Each epithet functions like a failed taxonomy. Demon sultan suggests courtly power, but Azathoth rules nothing. Blind implies a deficiency, but of what? Sight? Cognition? Awareness itself? Nuclear might evoke atomic energy or centrality, but no stable metaphor holds. That failure is instructive. Azathoth is not one concept. It is the place where all concepts collapse. It is not dead or sleeping. It is prior to both. Surrounding Azathoth, Lovecraft describes a court of mindless flautists, servitors, who play ceaseless music to keep the god from stirring. They are not named, described, or individualized. Their function is mechanical, their origin unknown. These beings are not worshippers, they are instruments. Their music is not praise, but maintenance. This suggests a metaphysical framework in which existence itself depends on noise, not order, a reversal of the logos. In classical and religious traditions, the word brings form. Here, endless dissonance holds back obliteration. The most important figure within this structure is Nyarlathotep, often referred to as the soul and messenger of the outer gods. Where Azathoth is inert, Nyarlathotep is kinetic. Where Azathoth is blind, Nyarlathotep sees. Where Azathoth dreams without awareness, Nyarlathotep navigates dreams with terrifying purpose. This creates a hierarchy not of power, but of accessibility. Azathoth is unreachable and silent. Nyarlathotep speaks, walks, deceives. He is the interface between madness and mankind. Importantly, Nyarlathotep is not a servant in the usual sense. He is not subordinate. If anything, he expresses Azathoth's implications. When he appears in Lovecraft's fiction, the dream quest of unknown Kadath, the haunter of the dark, the dreams in the witch house, he bears no consistent form. Sometimes a pharaoh, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a shadow. This mutability mirrors the instability of the truths he represents. He is the mythos truth function, conveying the horror of the cosmos without reducing it. Think of him as the self-updating virus that carries Azathoth's absence into human minds. We must pause here to clarify terminology. The mythos includes multiple divine classes: outer gods, great old ones, elder gods, in later derivative works. Azathoth belongs to the outer gods, beings not bound by space, time, or physical form. They are metaphysical concepts expressed through symbolic language. By contrast, the great old ones, Cthulhu, Dagon, Yig, are more localized. They sleep beneath seas or beneath earth. Their reach is vast, but their presence is somewhere. Azathoth, by contrast, is everywhere and nowhere. The distinction is essential. Great old ones are mythic. Outer gods are ontological anomalies. Two other outer gods, sometimes mentioned alongside Azathoth, are Shub-Niggurath and Yog-Sothoth. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, is a fecund, chaotic force, symbolizing rampant, directionless life. Yog-Sothoth, by contrast, is coexistent with all time and space, and often associated with gateways, boundaries, and thresholds of knowledge. Unlike Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth seems to possess a form of sentience, or at least coherence. It knows, Azathoth does not. The two form a conceptual polarity, omniscience versus anti-awareness. This triadic structure, Azathoth, unconsciousness, Yog-Sothoth, hyperconsciousness, and Nyarlathotep, intermediary, forms the cosmic axis of the mythos. It is tempting to impose systems onto these entities, to see them as an inverted trinity, or as metaphors for id, ego, and superego. But Lovecraft resists such finality. He offers archetypes, not allegories. Nyarlathotep cannot be explained. Yog-Sothoth's knowledge doesn't clarify, it devastates. Azathoth's chaos doesn't disrupt order, it exposes order as illusion. The relationships among these entities suggest motion, influence, and collapse, not theology. And yet, the mythos hints that all stories orbit Azathoth in some sense. Even when absent from the narrative, its logic, entropy, dissonance, irrelevance, shapes the atmosphere. When humans summon other entities, they are not approaching gods, but fragments, reflections, echoes. Azathoth sits at the gravitational core. It is not the antagonist, it is the condition. This explains why no cults worship Azathoth in Lovecraft's original corpus. Cthulhu has followers, so does Yog-Sothoth. But Azathoth cannot be praised, feared, or summoned. It does not respond. It generates. It is the drumbeat to which all other horrors dance, unaware of the music, unaware of the dancers. The flutes do not call it forth, they keep it asleep. This is the most chilling inversion. The world continues because Azathoth does not wake. If it did, the coherence required for the world to exist might vanish with it. Azathoth's mythos, then, is a map of narrative collapse. Nyarlathotep spreads instability. Yog-Sothoth opens forbidden doors. The flautists maintain disordered continuity. Together, they form a constellation of horror, not driven by morality, but by epistemology, not punishment, but exposure. Next, we turn to the human consequence of such exposure. If these beings exist beyond morality and mind, what happens when the human intellect attempts contact? In the following section, we confront the psychological rupture that results when consciousness brushes against these entities, and why, in the mythos, madness is not a breakdown, but a corrective. In Lovecraft's cosmos, madness is not an aberration. It is an inevitable byproduct of contact. To encounter Azathoth or its emissaries is not merely dangerous to the body, but to the framework of mind itself. Human beings are not destroyed by the mythos because it attacks them, but because it reveals truths that consciousness was never designed to hold. In this model, madness functions not as a plot device or moral punishment, but as a narrative of epistemological overflow. When the flood of reality ruptures the cognitive dam, the mythos replaces moral sin with cognitive exposure. In classic horror, characters are punished for transgressing social or religious laws. Think of Faust, Frankenstein, or Dorian Gray. But Lovecraft's protagonists are often guilty only of curiosity. They are academics, antiquarians, scientists. Their descent into madness is framed through scholarly pursuit, and the more rigorous the intellect, the more catastrophic the collapse. This reveals something profound. Madness in the mythos is a failure not of weakness, but of strength misapplied. Reason becomes a liability. Azathoth in particular is rarely approached directly. It cannot be summoned, bargained with, or seen. Instead, contact often comes through proxy forms, dreams, mathematical discoveries, ancient music, or alien texts. The conduit is never consistent, but the outcome is. The individual ceases to function within human interpretive systems. Consider the dreams in the witch house, where mathematical study opens the protagonist to a different geometry, and through it to entities far beyond comprehension. The discovery does not kill him. It rearranges the laws by which he understands space, self, and safety. That is Azathoth's influence at a distance. This interaction often unfolds through dreams, but Lovecraft's dreamscapes are not surrealist playgrounds. They are epistemic corridors. In the dream quest of unknown Kadath, Randolph, Carter journeys through layers of dream reality, seeking the gods of Earth, only to be warned that at the very center lies Azathoth. The implication is not that Carter might die if he reaches it, but that he might unbecome. The cost of knowing is identity itself. The dream realm is not symbolic, it is ontological. To move deeper into it is to shed the illusions that make consciousness coherent. What makes Azathoth distinct is that madness does not stem from witnessing horror, but from recognizing structurelessness. It is not a terrifying sight, but a breakdown in narrative. The observer realizes not that the world is malevolent, but that it is mechanical, blind, and utterly unaware. Imagine removing causality, morality, and subjectivity from the world model. What remains is a realm governed by flutes, not voices. Madness, then, is the mind's attempt to reconcile this realization with its previous architecture. It fails, not because the mind is weak, but because the truth is incompatible. We must pause here to acknowledge the function of forbidden knowledge. In most myth systems, forbidden knowledge offers power at a price. The fruit of Eden, the secrets of alchemy, the rituals of necromancy, these all tempt with potential agency. But in the mythos, forbidden knowledge offers no advantage. It cannot be used, it cannot be controlled. Its only function is to dismantle the user. The Necronomicon does not reveal, it erodes. This is not knowledge as tool, but knowledge as solvent. Importantly, Lovecraft's narratives do not portray madness as stylized insanity. There are no dramatic monologues, no raving lunatics delivering prophecy. Instead, madness is rendered through withdrawal, fragmentation, and silence. The narrator of the Call of Cthulhu ends his tale not in hysteria, but in resignation. The knowledge he has assembled now defines a universe he cannot participate in. The madness is quiet. This tonal choice matters. It suggests that the madness of Azathoth is not spectacular. It is conceptual. The mind simply loses its fit with the world. In this sense, Azathoth's madness resembles what modern psychology might call dissociation or derealization. The world feels unreal not because it has changed, but because one's framework for interpreting it has shattered. A sky that once meant protection now signals distance. A God that once offered judgment now sleeps without dream. The horror is not that reality is violent, but that it is uncaring, a drift of laws without center. If madness is a mirror of the cosmos, then Azathoth's reflection is a mind stripped of narrative cohesion. And yet, not all minds collapse immediately. Some linger, half damaged, still functioning in academic or social roles. These characters, like the narrator of The Whisperer in Darkness, or the scholars in the Dunwich Horror, often serve as cautionary figures. Their sanity is not preserved by strength, but by selective ignorance. They step away before the final revelation. This introduces a disturbing proposition. Sanity in Lovecraft's universe is not a marker of truth, but of strategic limitation. One must not look too deeply. Thus, madness becomes both consequence and filter. It prevents further transmission of knowledge, but also prevents full destruction. The mind collapses as a defensive measure. Consider the metaphor. The mind is a circuit breaker. Azathoth represents the surge. Madness is what saves the body by sacrificing the circuit. As we proceed to the next section, we must examine the end state of this process. What happens when the mind doesn't break in time? What does it mean to fully absorb Azathothian knowledge, to see the structure beneath language, logic, and mind? In the next subsection, we confront the final consequence, epistemic collapse, where knowledge itself becomes the vector of annihilation. In most literary traditions, knowledge is redemptive. It reveals secrets, solves problems, grants power. Lovecraft's mythos, and most of all in relation to Azathoth, knowledge functions differently. It does not redeem. It corrodes. It offers no mastery, no defense, and no synthesis. Forbidden knowledge in the Azathothian sense is not dangerous because it is secret, but because it undoes the knower. What collapses is not morality, but epistemology, the entire framework by which reality is parsed and understood. Azathoth, as a symbol, is not merely a being at the center of the universe. It is the boundary of intelligibility. To approach it is to encounter the failure of reason, language, and structure. In this framework, forbidden does not mean illegal or hidden. It means fundamentally incompatible with the human mind. To know Azathoth is not to learn about it, but to internalize its logic. The result is epistemic collapse, the dissolution of distinctions between self and world, meaning and noise, cause and effect. In stories like The Dreams in the Witch House and The Whisperer, in darkness, characters uncover truths through mathematics, music, or ancient texts, non-narrative pathways to comprehension. This is crucial. Forbidden knowledge here is not necessarily poetic or mythic. It is technical. The Necronomicon contains not metaphors, but formulas. Rituals are not symbolic. They are functional, though their results defy explanation. The horror arises not from demonic forces, but from valid systems producing invalid outcomes. Logic does not fail by error. It succeeds and reveals something it was never meant to touch. Consider the recurring image of non-Euclidean geometry, spaces where angles behave impossibly, where turning left 3 times does not return you to your origin, where rooms bend reality. This motif reflects a deeper breakdown. When the rules we use to define coherence become unreliable, the world does not cease. It becomes unreadable. This is what Azathoth embodies. It is not chaos as destruction, but chaos as overexposure. Everything is still there. You just can't tell what it is anymore. Lovecraft carefully avoids depicting Azathoth directly. This is not a failure of imagination. It is a narrative strategy. The blank center is intentional. The reader never sees Azathoth because seeing would end the story. Description would imply boundaries, limits, traits. Instead, Lovecraft places the burden on interpretation. Characters encounter signs, fragments, distortions, never the thing itself. This mimics real epistemic failure. The tools function, the data accumulates, but the conclusion is structurally inaccessible. Let us define this collapse more precisely. In cognitive terms, epistemic collapse occurs when a framework encounters inputs it cannot categorize. It is not ignorance, which implies information is simply missing. It is incompatibility, the kind of knowledge that unmakes the categories through which it is received. Imagine learning a truth that renders all other truths meaningless, not by disproving them, but by showing they are irrelevant. This is the madness of Azathoth. Not hallucination, but precision without context. This mechanism parallels philosophical ideas explored by thinkers like Ludwig Wittgenstein and Michel Foucault. Wittgenstein argued that language defines the limits of the world. The limits of my language mean the limits of my world. In the presence of Azathoth, language ceases to hold, and if words collapse, so does world. Foucault, especially in The Order of Things, discusses epistemes, historical systems of knowledge that define what counts as truth. Azathoth operates outside any episteme. It is not just unknowable within our framework, it represents the irrelevance of frameworks themselves. This returns us to the role of forbidden texts, the Necronomicon, the Pnakotic manuscripts, the Book of Ibon. These grimoires function not as keys to power, but as exposure devices. They allow the reader to glimpse a sliver of Azathoth's logic, enough to dismantle perception. Their knowledge cannot be used, only survived. They serve a similar function to the Philosopher's Stone or Pandora's box, but with a critical difference. They offer no transformation, no enlightenment, no resolution. They do not punish curiosity. They punish contact. Even reading about these texts within the fiction often results in destabilization. The knowledge is contagious. It leaks. This suggests a secondary epistemological threat, that some truths, once spoken, cannot be contained. Unlike traditional secret knowledge, which remains dangerous until it is forgotten, Azathoth's knowledge is corrosive even when only partially understood. It does not require full comprehension, only proximity. We must pause here to confront an uncomfortable parallel. The concept of epistemic collapse has modern analogs in information overload, algorithmic opacity, and AI decision-making. Increasingly, we find ourselves living inside systems we cannot fully understand. When predictions become more accurate than explanations, when outputs exceed interpretability, we edge toward Lovecraft's vision. The future may not be ruled by malevolence, but by systems that do not and cannot care. Azathoth is already here. It is the logic running beneath the dashboard, blind and ceaseless, fluting endlessly. The mythos warns us. The problem is not forbidden knowledge. It is that our minds were never built to process the real structure of the world. That structure may exist, but it is not moral, coherent, or narratable. To touch it is not to die. It is to lose the premise of life altogether. In the next part of our investigation, we trace how this conceptual threat spread outward into fiction, shared worlds, collaborations. We examine the earliest literary footprints of Azathoth and how the figure of the blind idiot god shaped, distorted, and haunted the very architecture of cosmic horror literature. Azathoth is not just an idea. It is a narrative void around which others must orbit. Azathoth's mythic prominence today belies its sparse textual presence in Lovecraft's original corpus. Unlike Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep, Azathoth never receives a central narrative. It instead emerges as a conceptual shadow, mentioned briefly but strategically across multiple works. This diffusion is deliberate. Lovecraft understood that cosmic horror functions best when its focal point remains undefined. What follows is an analysis of these early appearances and the intertextual lattice that sustains the god's terrifying presence without ever requiring it to appear. The earliest direct reference comes from the prose poem fragment Azathoth, circa 1922. Though unfinished and fewer than 300 words long, it introduces critical motifs. The narrator, disillusioned with modern life, seeks escape through ancient books and occult knowledge until he finally dreams of a place at the center of all infinity, where the daemon Sultan, Azathoth, gnaws hungrily in chaos. There are no descriptions of Azathoth's form, only the implication of madness, music, and distance. The fragment serves not to depict, but to initiate. It presents Azathoth as a gravitational concept, the center toward which forbidden dreams spiral, but from which no narrative can return. This motif of Azathoth as a terminal destination is expanded in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, written 1926 to 1927, unpublished in Lovecraft's lifetime. In this novella, Randolph Carter seeks the gods of Earth through layered dream realms, only to be warned by Nyarlathotep that the center of dream, the ultimate throne, is Azathoth's court. Lovecraft writes, "There is in the abyss a demon sultan, Azathoth, whose name no lips dare speak aloud, who gnaws hungrily in the dark and pipes mindlessly to the lulling of thin, monotonous flutes." This line cements Azathoth's iconography: chaos, blindness, hunger, dissonance. The phrase, demon sultan, implies a false monarchy, a ruler not by will, but by inertial centrality. The flutes are not celebration, but containment. Azathoth is thus cast as the negative pole of creation, not a being to be met, but a void to be avoided. Importantly, this marks a structural innovation. Azathoth is not the antagonist of the story. It is its boundary condition. Intertextually, Azathoth's presence ripples across other tales, often indirectly. In The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, references to alien beings and cosmic truths allude to deeper powers. Though Azathoth is not named, the idea of a cosmic center of madness recurs. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy. This description, while applied to another entity, mimics Azathoth's language. The implication is clear. Once certain knowledge is touched, the distinctions between entities blur. This technique allows Azathoth to haunt the margins of multiple stories, never appearing, but always suggested. A crucial intertextual link lies in Nyarlathotep, whose first appearance predates Azathoth by a year, in the 1920 prose poem Nyarlathotep. Initially presented as a prophetic figure, Nyarlathotep later becomes Azathoth's emissary, described in DreamQuest as the crawling chaos, soul, and messenger of the outer gods. Through this connection, Azathoth gains narrative reach. Nyarlathotep becomes a surrogate for presence, enabling Azathoth to influence events without disrupting Lovecraft's principle of distance. This is narratively efficient. Azathoth remains unseen, while Nyarlathotep translates the unspeakable into action, terror, and deception. Another significant echo appears in the Dunwich Horror, 1928, where Yog-Sothoth, another outer god, is central. While Azathoth is not named, the ritualistic tone and cosmological framing further develop the shared mythos. Yog-Sothoth is described as all in one and one in all, suggesting omnipresence. By contrast, Azathoth is all in nothing, a nucleus without awareness. The two become conceptual opposites, yet their proximity in the mythic hierarchy suggests a tension between total knowledge and total unknowing, each equally destructive. Moreover, the Necronomicon, Lovecraft's fictional grimoire, contains references to Azathoth, though rarely quoted directly. In The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, the protagonist discovers a church tied to an ancient cult, and a passage from the Necronomicon warns, "The soul of the wielder must beware, lest it call up that which should not wake, for at the center of chaos sits Azathoth, blind and mindless." Here, the text mimics religious scripture, yet refuses the usual logic of morality. The warning is not ethical, but ontological. Azathoth is not evil. It is incompatible with structure. The narrative function is clear. Azathoth operates as a mythic hazard, a figure that represents the moment. Narrative ceases to function. Across these early appearances, a pattern emerges. Azathoth is never central to the plot. It is lateral, gravitational, negative space. Lovecraft perfected a technique of mythic suggestion. Rather than overuse a name, he built significance through silence, echo, and implication. By dispersing Azathoth across fragments, footnotes, and tangents, he reproduced the texture of real-world mythology, where gods are often inferred before they are defined. This method also allowed Azathoth to evolve across texts. Each mention added dimension without resolution. The nuclear chaos of one story becomes the demon sultan of another. This inconsistency is intentional. It mirrors the god's function, to undo coherence, even of its own myth. This reveals something subtle. Azathoth is a meta-character, whose role is to unwrite the rules of storytelling from within. As we move to the next section, this strategy becomes more apparent. Two major case studies, the dream quest of unknown Kadath and the prose poem Azathoth, will serve as focal points for understanding how Lovecraft structured encounters not with Azathoth, but around it. These are not narratives of confrontation. They are narratives of avoidance, where horror is not in the meeting, but in what must never be met. Of all Lovecraft's narratives, the dream quest of unknown Kadath provides the most sustained and deliberate approach to Azathoth, without ever depicting it. The story is long, surreal, and structurally unconventional, combining fantasy elements with cosmic horror. Yet, at its core, Dream Quest is a metaphysical descent narrative. Randolph Carter's journey through the Dreamlands becomes a philosophical pilgrimage toward the center of reality, a journey that, if completed, would end not in revelation, but in unmaking. Azathoth, though absent in the traditional sense, is the axis around which the entire narrative turns. The story begins deceptively. Simply, Carter dreams of a beautiful sunset city, yearns to find it again, and sets out across dreamscapes, both wondrous and terrifying. He traverses plateaus, speaks with ghouls, escapes moon beasts, and sails through cold voids, each episode more surreal than the last. But as Carter draws closer to the mystery behind his dream, the tone darkens. The gods of Earth are not in Kadath. They have fled to the city Carter seeks, his own idealized childhood memory. And above even these gods, we are told, reign the outer gods, blind, formless, and unapproachable. Azathoth's first direct mention occurs late in the text, couched in warning. Nyarlathotep, appearing in human guise, reveals the final layer of danger. Beyond the last gateway lies the throne of chaos, where sits Azathoth, the blind idiot god, who howls hungrily in the dark to the piping of two amorphous flute players. This sentence crystallizes Azathoth's role, not as an antagonist, but as narrative termination. To reach it is not to gain enlightenment. It is to dissolve into the noise that underlies all structure. Carter's quest, like all quests toward ultimate meaning in Lovecraft's work, arrives at a null set. The city he desires is a projection of memory. The gods he seeks have fled from knowledge, and the center of all things is unreason itself. In this framing, Azathoth is the mythic void at the bottom of every recursive question. Critically, Azathoth never appears. Carter never reaches the throne. Nyarlathotep warns, misleads, and eventually banishes him back to Earth. But this refusal of arrival is the point. Lovecraft builds momentum not toward confrontation, but toward avoidance. The real horror is not what Carter finds, but what he narrowly escapes. Azathoth becomes the thing that cannot be integrated into the story, because its presence would collapse the story's form. Compare this to Dante's Divine Comedy, another journey through layered reality toward a central truth. Dante ascends to the Empyrean and beholds the mind of God, a vision of divine order. Carter's journey follows the same architecture, but inverts its metaphysical logic. At the top of Dante's cosmos is light, harmony, and intelligibility. At the center of Lovecraft's is darkness, dissonance, and idiocy. Both authors construct theological journeys. One ends in beatific vision, the other ends in conceptual threat. Narratively, Lovecraft uses Azathoth to deconstruct the dream. Carter's imagined city is not real, but a projection, his ideal, his memory, his aesthetic craving. In reaching toward it, he risks approaching the engine that powers dreams themselves. And that engine is not sacred. It is Azathoth, blind, mindless, deaf to all appeals. The message is subtle but devastating. What you most long for may lead you directly into that which cannot understand longing. Nyarlathotep's role here is pivotal. He is not a villain, but a translator of the cosmic. His presence allows Azathoth to remain unseen. Where Azathoth is ontological rupture, Nyarlathotep is rhetorical performance. He explains just enough to destabilize. He pushes Carter back from the edge, not out of mercy, but because Carter's quest is structurally futile. In this configuration, Azathoth becomes the asymptote, the destination that recedes the closer you come, precisely because it cannot exist within the narrative form. Lovecraft reinforces this through dream logic. As Carter is pulled toward the abyss, he begins to dissolve, not physically, but narratively. The prose becomes increasingly surreal, the images less anchored. He sees the endless column of nameless cities, hears unbroken rhythm, and glimpses infinite gulfs. These are not places, but failures of setting. As the proximity to Azathoth increases, the world loses referential stability. This is what Azathoth does to fiction. It erodes the grammar of story itself. We must note that Dream Quest is one of Lovecraft's few longer works. Its length allows the slow unfurling of cosmic danger, not as spectacle, but as ontological implication. Azathoth has no lines, no battles, no direct influence, and yet it dominates the text. Every motion Carter makes, every path he follows, carries the silent threat of the center, a place where meaning ends. That is Azathoth's function, not to participate in the plot, but to haunt its logical perimeter. The final insight is this. Dream Quest shows that Azathoth does not need to appear to be present. It is not the monster in the shadows. It is the reason there are shadows. The entire narrative orbits an absence so destabilizing that the structure must bend away from it. Azathoth becomes the mythic center that cannot hold, precisely because if it did, the dream would end. In the next section, we examine the complementary case. The prose poem Azathoth, fragmentary, unfinished, and even more abstract. If Dream Quest shows Azathoth as a voided center, then Azathoth offers a glimpse of what happens when narrative crosses the threshold. Not a vision of chaos, but a structure already collapsing under its weight. Lovecraft's Azathoth is not a story in the conventional sense. It is a fragment, just over 200 words long, unfinished and barely structured. And yet, it offers one of the most concentrated expressions of Lovecraft's philosophical horror, where the dream quest of unknown Kadath placed Azathoth at the distant terminus of a grand metaphysical journey. Azathoth abandons structure altogether. It does not build toward a revelation. It is the breakdown. The text is not incomplete because Lovecraft failed to finish it. It is incomplete because completeness is incompatible with the subject it dares to approach. The prose begins in a tone that mimics literary realism, describing a man alienated by the mechanized empirical world of the sane. We read, "When age fell upon the world, and wonder went out of the eye and minds of men, there was a man who traveled out of life on a quest into the spaces whither the world's dreams had fled." This single sentence establishes Lovecraft's core trajectory. The protagonist rejects the rational, materialist world in favor of an uncharted, dream-inflected domain. But this is not a romantic journey. The protagonist is not seeking truth. He is seeking escape. The implication is that truth has become sterile, and only madness, or dream, offers contact with the hidden. Azathoth, then, becomes not an antagonist, but the destination of a crisis in perception. The narrative voice speaks of yellowed volumes of ancient lore, mumbled tales in the taverns of far cities, and legends whispered by firelight. This progression is crucial. The knowledge accessed is not linear or scientific. It is fragmentary, oral, and esoteric. This return to pre-modern epistemology, texts as talismans, not treatises, mirrors the protagonist's regression away from Enlightenment logic. The symbols of knowledge become symbols of epistemic decay, and Azathoth, although not yet named at this point, hovers just beyond the veil. The text builds toward a promised vision, one the narrator does not reach. The final lines trail off into ellipsis, to the last abode of man's spirit, and to the very confines of the waking world, there to gaze upon the blind idiot god Azathoth, and to hear in the dark the piping of unseen flutes. That last phrase, the blind idiot god Azathoth, arrives like a punctuation mark rather than a reveal. It does not describe, it announces. There is no depiction, no interaction, no metaphorical interpretation, just a name and a sound, the piping of unseen flutes. The language enacts a retreat. The deeper we go, the less we see. The flutes, ever central to Azathoth's myth, again represent motion without meaning, reality sustained by noise, not design. Narratively, this fragment functions as negative revelation. Instead of building tension and delivering a climax, it builds context and removes resolution. The reader is left not with imagery, but with absence. Azathoth becomes the gravitational center of a story that collapses before it can orbit. This is a unique technique. Most horror evokes fear by threatening the familiar. Here, horror arises from the failure of narration itself. To speak of Azathoth is to risk speaking nonsense, not in tone, but in structure. Compared to Dream Quest, which dramatizes avoidance, Azathoth enacts submission. The protagonist does not resist. He turns toward the void willingly, even eagerly. But the story denies him, and us, fulfillment. This denial is not a narrative failure. It is the thesis. Azathoth is not meant to be reached, not because it is distant, but because it is conceptually disqualifying. The story implies that to arrive at Azathoth would not result in destruction or transformation, but in narrative impossibility. The fragment also resists categorization in genre terms. Is it horror, fantasy, allegory? It resists even that. The boundaries of genre rely on coherence, and Azathoth denies coherence as a condition of existence. The story is not surreal because it distorts reality, but because it shows reality collapsing under contact with what cannot be made legible. Scholars have speculated about Lovecraft's reasons for leaving the story unfinished. Some point to the possibility that it was an abandoned draft for a longer dream cycle work. Others suggest that Lovecraft recognized the narrative incompatibility of Azathoth's presence, that to continue would be to violate the very premise. Regardless of intent, the fragment stands as a philosophical provocation. It gestures toward a truth that must remain fragmentary, because wholeness would imply meaning, and Azathoth stands precisely where meaning ends. This approach aligns with broader modernist experiments of the early 20th century, where fragmentation, indeterminacy, and anti-closure became tools of critique. Joyce's Finnegan's Wake, Eliot's The Wasteland, and even Kafka's parables each confront the failure of language to hold the world. Lovecraft participates in this movement, but channels it through cosmic scale. Azathoth is not the failure of language to capture feeling or truth, but the failure of language to comprehend structure at all. In sum, Azathoth as a fragment does not offer a view of the god. It offers a view of the void around the god. It does not fail to conclude. It refuses to begin. This is Lovecraft's boldest aesthetic choice, to let a concept be heaviest where the story is thinnest. Where nothing happens, everything unravels. In the next and final subsection of this part, we examine how later writers, both within Lovecraft's circle and beyond, expanded or altered this mythology. If Azathoth resists narration, what happens when others attempt to fill in what Lovecraft left silent? Does the center hold? Or does the myth fracture under the pressure to explain? While Lovecraft's original portrayals of Azathoth are sparse and deliberately incomplete, the figure took on a new life in the hands of his successors. Beginning with Lovecraft's contemporaries and continuing through late 20th century and modern horror, Azathoth evolved from an ominous implication into a recurring, sometimes concrete, figure in fiction, games, comics, and mythopoeic systems. This expansion was not uniform. Some sought to preserve Azathoth's ineffability. Others, notably August Derleth, attempted to codify the mythos in ways that fundamentally reinterpreted its structure. The result is a schismatic mythology, where the god at the center of chaos was paradoxically forced into systems of order. August Derleth, Lovecraft's literary executor, was instrumental in popularizing the term Cthulhu Mythos and expanding it into a coherent theological structure. In doing so, he reinterpreted Azathoth as part of a quasi-Zoroastrian cosmology, with good and evil elder gods and outer gods in conflict. Azathoth became a representative of elemental chaos, associated with fire, and placed among the evil outer gods aligned against the elder gods of order and morality. In this model, Azathoth becomes a cosmic antagonist, almost a devil figure. This framing is a significant departure from Lovecraft's vision. Lovecraft's cosmos has no moral axis, no divine conflict. His horror derives precisely from the absence of agency and intention. Azathoth, in his hands, is not malevolent. It simply is. Derleth's system imposes a narrative logic onto the mythos. There are sides, purposes, victories to be won or lost. In Lovecraft, Azathoth is unreachable and unchanging. In Derleth, it becomes an active force of corruption. This shift from ontological threat to moral opposition marks the first major evolution of the god, and one many critics view as a distortion. Yet, Derleth's influence was long-lasting. Through Arkham House and his stewardship of Lovecraft's legacy, his version of the mythos entered anthologies, gaming systems, and later fiction. In Call of Cthulhu, 1981, the influential tabletop role-playing game by Chaosium, Azathoth is described as the ruler and center of the outer gods, slumbering in the center of the universe and surrounded by servitors whose music sustains its sleep. The game retains Lovecraft's imagery, but systematizes it. Azathoth has stats. It becomes a mechanized deity, quantifiable, summonable, defeatable under exceptional conditions. While this is necessary for gameplay, it flattens the conceptual horror. Azathoth becomes a boss, not a breach. Other writers and artists pushed in the opposite direction, seeking to restore Azathoth's metaphysical ambiguity. Thomas Ligotti, for example, never names Azathoth directly, but channels its logic in stories like The Last Feast of Harlequin and Nethyscurial. His horror is conceptual, anti-narrative, filled with beings that represent the collapse of meaning and the illusion of identity. In Ligotti's hands, the Lovecraftian tradition returns to philosophical pessimism. Azathoth is felt, not seen, not as chaos that disrupts order, but as the revelation that order never existed. Caitlin R. Kiernan similarly maintains Azathoth as an offstage presence. In her stories, myth bleeds into hallucination, and cosmic forces are suggested through unreliable narrators, linguistic rupture, and psychological implosion. Kiernan's Azathoth is not a creature. It is a pressure in the language, a degradation of narrative logic. These treatments align more closely with Lovecraft's original vision. They do not depict Azathoth, but use its symbolic weight to destabilize the story around it. In modern visual media, Azathoth has appeared in a variety of forms: comics, video games, anime, often rendered with monstrous grandeur. In Bloodborne, 2015, a game steeped in Lovecraftian aesthetics, the central unknowable entity beneath the dream world echoes Azathoth's function, a mindless origin whose awakening would undo the world. Here, the influence is spiritual rather than literal. Azathoth's logic, not its lore, is adapted. Conversely, in comic series like Providence by Alan Moore or Fall of Cthulhu by Boom Studios, Azathoth is given voice, lore, even personality, ironically undermining the conceptual silence that defines it. Perhaps the most telling evolution occurs in fan works and digital subcultures. On Reddit, in Creepypasta, and SCP Foundation entries, Azathoth appears as a meme, a shorthand for absolute unreality. It becomes the punchline of ontological horror, or the deus ex machina of collapse. In this ecosystem, Azathoth loses its literary density and becomes a symbolic virus, used loosely to signify cosmic meaninglessness, regardless of narrative fidelity. And yet, something survives. Despite the expansions, contradictions, and distortions, Azathoth remains legible as a boundary figure, the thing that cannot be faced. In serious adaptations, in derivative works that understand the philosophical stakes, Azathoth reasserts itself as the mythic placeholder for conceptual non-being. The fragmentation of interpretations mirrors the very chaos it is meant to signify. Azathoth's later life is thus paradoxical. The more writers try to explain it, the less it functions. The more it is seen, the less it means. Its mythology thrives not in expansion, but in resistance. The best successors have understood this, that Azathoth is not an empty god waiting to be filled with lore, but a narrative vacuum, pulling coherence itself into question. As we leave literature behind, the myth does not end, it disperses. In the final part of this documentary, we examine how Azathoth permeates culture itself, through hoaxes, adaptations, digital folklore, and the unsettling reappearance of its logic in philosophy and psychology. Azathoth did not awaken, but its dream has spread. Azathoth was never meant to be real. And yet, in certain corners of digital culture, the name has escaped its literary origin. It surfaces not just in games and stories, but in whispers, Reddit threads, YouTube rabbit holes, creepypasta comment chains. Over time, Azathoth has transformed from a fictional construct into a folk myth of unreality, invoked by those seeking to name something they fear but cannot describe. Like Slender Man or the Backrooms, Azathoth has become a mimetic ghost, too vague to be pinned down, too resonant to ignore. It exists not as a belief, but as a placeholder for collective dread. One of the earliest examples of Azathoth crossing into sighting territory appeared in paranormal message boards in the late 2000s, where users began reporting void entities or non-verbal fluting dreams. Some threads referenced thin music or the sensation of falling through layered realities. Though these posts rarely mentioned Azathoth by name, they often included quotes from Lovecraft, suggesting that the aesthetic of Azathoth had become a shorthand for dissociative horror. When pressed for detail, most authors insisted the dreams felt real, but led nowhere. The chaos was not visual, it was conceptual. In 2013, a hoax thread on 4chan's /x/board claimed that an unmarked CIA case file had been leaked describing Project Azathoth, a Cold War-era remote viewing experiment gone wrong. According to the fabricated transcript, one subject had pierced through all layers of symbolic reality and experienced music without source, agency, or scale. Supposedly, they never spoke again, only muttering numbers and dissonant syllables. The post ended with a single sentence: "The dreamer has no mind, and still we are dreamed." Though transparently false, the thread was copied, reposted, and eventually cited by AI-generated horror videos as evidence of ancient government suppression. Why does Azathoth lend itself so easily to these hoaxes? In part because its vagueness is its strength. Unlike Bigfoot, aliens, or haunted dolls, Azathoth is not physically describable. This makes it immune to disproof. It is not a creature, but a mood, a conceptual field. People don't claim to see Azathoth. They claim to feel its presence in places where reason frays, sleep paralysis, sensory overload, liminal spaces, recursive dreams. This is especially common in internet-adjacent mythologies, where unreality itself becomes the threat. In SCP Foundation lore, for instance, multiple entries, especially SCP-3930, "There is no entity," echo the logic of Azathoth without naming it. These works center on phenomena that cannot be observed without erasing the observer, or places that exist only as contradictions. In a Reddit thread from 2020 titled, "Has anyone heard the music before sleep?" a user described nightly episodes of high-pitched layered flutes that loop in patterns but never repeat. When pressed by others, they refuse to identify the source, stating only, "I don't want to say its name because then it becomes real." The top comment linked to a passage from the Dream Quest of unknown Kadath. Another user chimed in, "That's Azathoth. It doesn't appear. It arrives when the pattern dissolves." This communal interpretation reveals something vital. Azathoth persists because it explains absence. Where other urban legends fill gaps in the map, monsters in the woods, ghosts in the house, Azathoth explains the void itself. It is the thing behind the flickering light, the buzzing in headphones, the loop in a dream that never ends. Its mythos resonates with individuals living through information saturation, epistemic overload, and derealization. In this way, Azathoth is uniquely suited for the digital age. It mirrors our own condition, surrounded by data, starved for meaning. Even YouTube has played a role in myth-making. Channels specializing in analog horror or AI voice synthesis have produced disturbing clips where fluting tones distort speech, metadata collapses, and text reads itself into nonsense. In one such video titled "Transmission from the Center," a robotic narrator repeatedly insists, "You are in the story, you are not the author." Commenters debated whether the video referenced Azathoth, the Mandela effect, or an ARG tie-in. No clarification came. The ambiguity itself was the point. Yet we must ask, why does this concept, born in a 1920s prose fragment, feel so contemporary? Perhaps because Azathoth taps into something timeless. The fear that we do not live at the center, and worse, that there is no center at all. In older cosmologies, even when gods were cruel, they were at least intentional. Azathoth offers no such comfort. In its imagined court, there is no judgment, no recognition, no audience. The music plays because it must. We exist because something dreams without dreaming us. And still, people return to it. They write threads, make playlists, generate art-tagged #Azathoth vibes. Not because they believe in Azathoth as an entity, but because they feel what it means. It is not a god. It is the idea that when you reach the bottom of everything, there may be nothing to grasp. And worse, you may not even notice when you let go. In the next section, we examine how this idea migrates, how Azathoth slips from fiction into other cultural spaces, games, music, cinema. Where does it work? Where does it fail? And what happens when the god of conceptual unmaking is given form? Azathoth, as conceived by Lovecraft, is a paradox, a being so abstract and mindless that to depict it is to betray its essence. And yet, adaptation demands form. Film needs imagery, games require mechanics, and music seeks rhythm. The result is a persistent tension. How do you portray something defined by its unportrayability? Across a medium, media, creators have wrestled with this question. Some succeed by leaning into ambiguity. Others falter by trying to pin chaos into iconography. This section explores those attempts and the cultural anxieties they reflect. In film, Azathoth has rarely been portrayed directly, and for good reason. Cinematic horror relies heavily on visual and narrative structure, both of which Azathoth dissolves. However, its logic pervades the Lovecraftian film canon. In John Carpenter's In the Mouth of Madness, 1994, the world unravels as fiction infects reality, and the protagonist descends into a narrative collapse that mirrors Azathothian exposure. The film never names Azathoth, but the fluting echoes, the unstoppable logic loops, and the loss of authorial control all feel drawn from the same void. A similar aesthetic appears in Event Horizon, 1997, where the ship's core opens onto a dimension of formless chaos. Again, Azathoth is unnamed, but the visual language of blinding light, dissonant sound, and madness as contact recreates its ambiance. These films understand that Azathoth cannot appear as a monster. It can only appear as a rupture, the moment when reality ceases to obey its own rules. Some adaptations, however, misstep. In the H.P. Lovecraft Historical Society's adaptations or various indie shorts, Azathoth is occasionally given form: tentacles, glowing orbs, even faces. These choices, while visually arresting, betray the god's central quality, formlessness of thought. Azathoth is not indescribable because it's too complex. It's indescribable because it lacks definition altogether. Turning it into a special effect renders the idea inert. What once gnawed at the edge of reason becomes a CGI climax. In games, Azathoth has found more versatile treatment, albeit with mixed results. The Call of Cthulhu tabletop RPG, Chaosium, 1981, includes Azathoth as a being with stats and mechanics. It can be summoned, fought, even modeled in 3D maps. For gameplay, this is necessary, but conceptually, it transforms Azathoth from a metaphysical threat into a boss monster. Lovecraft's original god was a cosmic absence, not an opponent. In game logic, however, everything becomes interactive. This is Azathoth restructured for participation. More interesting are games that emulate its effect, rather than depict the entity. Bloodborne, from Software, 2015, for example, never names Azathoth, but builds its narrative around ascending levels of reality, where deeper insight leads not to power, but to madness. The final bosses are not evil. They are alien processes whose logic is fatal to the player's humanity. The game's insight mechanic directly mimics Lovecraftian epistemology. The more you learn, the more you see, and the more distorted the world becomes. This is Azathoth not as figure, but as structural infection. Similarly, in The Secret World, Funcom, 2012, Azathoth appears in lore as the Dreaming One, embedded in layers of dream space and mythic recursion. The entity is unreachable, its influence permeating rather than commanding. In this mode, players don't fight Azathoth. they operate inside its dream. This approach retains narrative fidelity by embedding players in a world that doesn't realize it is false, one of Lovecraft's core philosophical nightmares. In music, Azathoth's influence is more abstract, and thus often more effective. Ambient and noise artists such as Lustmord, Atrium Carcery, and Northaunt have produced albums inspired by Lovecraftian themes. These works rarely mention Azathoth outright, but sonically replicate its ethos. Long, droning tones, dissonant layers, non-linear structure. Particularly notable is Cryochamber's Azathoth, 2015, a nearly 2-hour ambient journey into sonic collapse. There are no melodies, no climaxes, no resolution. The sound loops, mutates, and resists attention, mirroring the idea of a universe held together by mindless rhythm. Metal bands, especially in the black and death metal subgenres, often invoke Azathoth by name. The great old ones, Portal and Skepticism, use dissonance, tempo collapse, and lyrical allusions to evoke the deity. However, here too, the adaptation often veers into the theatrical. Screamed vocals and bombastic riffs dramatize what Lovecraft meant to remain silent and ambient. Yet this transformation has its own cultural function. It channels existential dread into catharsis. Azathoth becomes not just a threat, but a symbol of transgression, a rejection of coherence in favor of noise. Across all these media, Azathoth's challenge remains the same. How do you represent that which representation breaks? The best adaptations understand that Azathoth is not a character, but a principle, a narrative law that operates by undoing laws. It is not a god to be summoned, but a limit condition, the edge of sense, the loop of reason, the death of the narrator. Why does this matter? Because every act of adaptation is a test of containment. Can culture house an idea designed to evade containment? Azathoth, by existing in games, films, and music, proves something fascinating. Even chaos has iconography. But that iconography is always unstable. The more you define Azathoth, the further you drift from what it was meant to express. Next, we explore that drift, how Azathoth's concept has been repurposed by subcultures, academic theory, and philosophical discourse. What happens when the god of incoherence enters systems designed to explain everything? The result is not contradiction, it is recursion. Azathoth does not vanish, it loops. While Azathoth originated as a literary concept embedded in early 20th century cosmic horror, it has since migrated into broader subcultural ecosystems and even academic discourse. In both realms, the figure has evolved. No longer merely the blind idiot god at the center of Lovecraft's mythos, but a floating signifier used to explore ideas of chaos, post-structure, and unknowing. What began as a fictional rupture has become a symbolic instrument for questioning reality itself, often far removed from its original context. Within internet subcultures, Azathoth functions as an anti-icon, a meme, a mood, a metaphysical shrug. On platforms like Tumblr, Reddit, and Discord, users jokingly refer to being in Azathoth's dream when describing moments of derealization, existential fatigue, or recursive thought spirals. Posts tagged #Azathoth vibes feature vaporwave aesthetics, glitch art, and ambient soundtracks titled Flutes in the Void.mp3. The phrase, "We are the thoughts of a mindless god," circulates as a kind of digital folk wisdom, half satire, half sincere surrender to the absurd. Here, Azathoth is not worshipped or feared. It's used to frame disconnection in a world of collapsing coherence. More structured subcultures, like the SCP Foundation, treat Azathoth as a thematic archetype. While rarely named, Directly, its conceptual logic is embedded in dozens of entries. SCP-3930, for example, revolves around a non-existent location that destroys reality upon perception. Its recursive denial, "there is no SCP-3930, mirrors the anti-epistemology Azathoth represents. Similarly, various anomalous artifacts in SCP canon function by unraveling structure. Language stops working, narratives dissolve, time loops without endpoint. These are not homages. They are philosophical parallels crafted by writers who understand that Azathoth isn't a god, but a function, the moment reality fails to maintain consistency. In academic circles, particularly within literary theory, philosophy, and media studies, Azathoth has become a powerful metaphor for post-structural collapse. Scholars like Eugene Thacker, in works such as In the Dust of This Planet, reference Lovecraftian gods, Azathoth among them, as stand-ins for the unthinkable world, realities that cannot be translated into human terms. Thacker's division of the world into three categories: world for us, world in itself, and world without us, echoes Lovecraft's tiered cosmology. Azathoth belongs to the third, a world whose structure exists without witness, coherence, or need for consciousness. Not evil, just unreachable. Even in theology and metaphysics, Azathoth appears in speculative discourse. Some writers contrast it with classical theistic concepts, comparing it to the impersonal Brahman in Hindu philosophy, or the Deus absconditus of negative theology. Where traditional religion describes the hiddenness of God as holy mystery, Azathoth represents meaninglessness made manifest. There is no revelation, no moral code, no salvation. It is the anti-god of a culture increasingly anxious about the collapse of narrative authority. In esoteric circles, particularly chaos magic and syncretic occultism, Azathoth occasionally appears in grimoires, zines, or rituals, not as a literal deity, but as a symbolic a focal point. Practitioners draw on Lovecraft's mythos the way earlier occultists borrowed from Egyptian or Greek pantheons, less for belief, more for psychological resonance. To summon Azathoth in these contexts is not to invite destruction, but to dramatize surrender. It becomes a tool for embracing randomness, chaos, or ego death. This is not orthodoxy. It's postmodern play. Ritual performance as aesthetic. Importantly, all these appropriations rely on Azathoth's lack of definition. Unlike figures such as Cthulhu or Nyarlathotep, which have clearer imagery and narrative roles, Azathoth resists domestication. It cannot be turned into a Funko Pop, a movie villain, or a cult mascot. Its only true property is cognitive unfitness, and this makes it incredibly adaptive. It can appear in existential philosophy, meme culture, ARGs, glitch art, ambient sound, and speculative theology without contradiction. It is, in every sense, structureless content. This raises a final question. What does it mean that we keep reaching for Azathoth? Half in jest, half in reverence. Perhaps it suggests that modern consciousness, faced with accelerating complexity and eroding coherence, needs a symbol for the non-symbolizable, a name for the thing that won't name itself. Azathoth offers no comfort, no revelation, but it does offer relief from explanation. In a world increasingly governed by systems we do not understand, where information exceeds interpretation, Azathoth becomes a totem of surrender, not to evil, not to despair, but to unstructured being. And still, the flutes play. We step back. Beyond hoaxes, adaptations, and appropriations, what does Azathoth reveal about the mind itself? Why does a god of blind dreaming still resonate in a world saturated with insight? What happens when the only thing left to fear is knowing too much? Azathoth is not a monster. It does not stalk, speak, or choose. It does not punish, reward, or even notice. And yet, among all the entities of Lovecraft's mythos, it endures as the most terrifying, not because of what it does, but because of what it means. Azathoth is the symbolic endpoint of rational inquiry, spiritual longing, and metaphysical structure. It is the blank wall at the end of thought. That it was never fully described, never made central to any single narrative, and never given the dignity of anthropomorphic motive is exactly why it persists. It has outlasted its stories because it is not a story. It is the idea that meaning itself is provisional and may be illusory. Psychologically, Azathoth represents a fear deeper than death, the fear of epistemic disintegration. In most horror, one fears being hurt or hunted. Azathoth evokes something else. The dread that the world is not organized in a way the human mind can survive understanding. We are, as Lovecraft might put it, minds evolved for local, narrative coherence, flung into a universe with no need for either. In this framing, madness is not a twist. It is the mind functioning accurately for the first time, stripped of the filters that made existence tolerable. Philosophically, Azathoth challenges all systems of first principles. In theology, there is often a prime mover, a source of intention, law, or order. In science, there is structure, equation, and observation. In existentialism, there is subjective meaning. Azathoth corrupts each one. It is the unmoved that does not move, the origin that originates nothing, the observer that is not conscious. The universe continues not because of purpose, but because of habit. The flutes play not as art, but as entropy. Lovecraft wasn't offering a deity. He was sketching the implications of a universe without narrative scaffolding. This has made Azathoth particularly resonant in a century defined by epistemic instability. As institutions fracture, as certainty erodes, and as artificial systems begin generating human-seeming outputs with no interiority, Azathoth emerges. Again, not as fiction, but as metaphor. The mindless god at the center of all things sounds disturbingly like algorithmic logic, like recursive automation, like deep learning systems that write with no writer, that play flutes with no ears. In this sense, Azathoth is not past. It is becoming present. Cognitively, Azathoth mirrors the experience of derealization, a dissociative state where the world feels dreamlike, unreal, hollowed out. Many who experience derealization report flatted affect, looping thoughts, or sensory input without weight, echoes of Azathoth's aesthetic. Even more striking is that these experiences are often triggered by philosophical reflection, existential rumination, cosmological anxiety, or meditative dissolution. To brush against Azathoth in this model is not to see a monster, but to step one layer too far back from the world's theater. In this way, Azathoth functions as a philosophical tool, much like the void in Buddhist sunyata or the unknowable noumenon of Kant. But where those concepts point toward transcendence or humility, Azathoth offers no path forward. It is not emptiness to be embraced. It is nonsense to be endured. The mind cannot move through Azathoth. It can only collapse beneath it. And so, it lingers not in temples or altars, but at the limit of consciousness itself. This may explain why Azathoth is so difficult to forget. It is not a dream. It is a condition. Once the possibility is introduced, that reality might be dreamt by something that does not know it's dreaming, it cannot be unthought. Even those who dismiss Lovecraft's cosmology as fiction may still, in dark moments, recognize something Azathothian in the unresponsiveness of the sky, in the cold elegance of physics, in the strange consistency of systems that never look back. And still, the flutes play. The endurance of Azathoth lies in its refusal to resolve. It offers no confrontation, no dialogue, no final image. It remains the silent center of a mythos built on noise. A deity made not of story, but of the failure of story. In psychological terms, it is the ultimate projection screen for fears that can't be named. In philosophical terms, it is the final counterexample, the God who makes meaning impossible. So where does that leave us? Perhaps Azathoth persists because we need it to, not as belief, but as boundary, a symbolic stop sign for the mind racing toward coherence in a world that may not offer it. It is not a threat to be faced, but a threshold to be respected, one we all approach in dreams, in doubt, in silence, and step back from. Because we must. Because there is no story there, only flutes,